Hello, everyone. This is Ryan Law, the current chairperson for the Technology Committee here at ASGE. Today, we would like to have another round of author interviews for an upcoming technology review published by our committee. The charges of the Technology Committee at ASGE are to provide reviews of existing, new, or emerging endoscopic technologies that have an impact on the practice of GI endoscopy. Overall, we provide evidence-based methods with a Medline literature search to identify pertinent clinical studies on the topic, as well as manufacturer and user facility device experience database search to identify the reported adverse events of a given technology, otherwise known as the MOD database. Both are supplemented by accessing the related articles feature of PubMed and by scrutinizing any pertinent references cited by identified studies. These controlled clinical trials are certainly emphasized, but in many cases, data from randomized trials are lacking. In such cases, large case series, preliminary clinical studies, and expert opinions are used. Technical data are gathered from traditional and web-based publications, proprietary publications, and informal communications with pertinent vendors. Technology status evaluation reports are generally drafted by one or two members of the ASGE Technology Committee and reviewed and edited by the remainder committee. Today, I have with me Dr. Sam Hahn from Ohio State University and Dr. Mohit Girotra from Swedish Medical Center in Washington. They have graciously agreed to do an author interview related to their upcoming publication on the use of Guidewires in GI endoscopy. I'll start with Dr. Hahn. Sam, could you tell us why we felt as a tech committee that this particular topic was necessary to update at the present time?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, for having us. We really appreciate it. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic in that, Guidewires are, as based on appearance, it doesn't really look like much has changed, but our use of Guidewires has really expanded, particularly with the use of therapeutic endoscopic ultrasound, or EUS. So we really want to take the opportunity to be able to kind of present how Guidewires are being utilized. We also felt like the prior document, rather, kind of didn't really get to talk too much about long and short systems, which are really kind of ubiquitous in today's advanced endoscopy world. So we wanted to be able to describe that, as well as provide kind of practical guidance in terms of how to use Guidewires in the advanced endoscopy setting.
Thank you. Dr. Girotra, many people, or probably most people in endoscopy are familiar with the use of Guidewires in the sense of ERCP and now therapeutic EUS. Could you speak a little bit to some of the other applications of the importance of Guidewires in endoscopy?
Thanks, Ryan. Absolutely. So it's not only advanced endoscopy, interventional endoscopy, ERCP, EUS, where we use Guidewires. In fact, the first exposure a gastroenterologist or a GI trainee gets to Guidewires is during upper endoscopy. It is routinely used for luminal dilation. It is used for stenting. It is also sometimes used for placement of tubes within the GI tract, whether that is NG tube, NJ tube. To traverse any anatomical distortions, we often use safe passage of endoscope through the upper esophageal sphincter or through tight areas, whether in the esophagus or stomach or duodenum. Sometimes these are used. Guidewires are also inbuilt and a part of many of our dilation equipment. So those are few of its uses in the upper GI tract. And then in the lower GI tract, of course, to traverse any colonic or any small bowel also, stenosis, Guidewires can help as a pathway. With or without fluoroscopy, these are very often used.
Dr. Hahn, you mentioned the variety of Guidewires out there. From kind of a 10,000-foot view, can you give our listeners and viewers a little bit of kind of a session on the differences, the major differences when we think about the types of Guidewires available?
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. And so really, I think it's easiest to think about Guidewires first in terms of kind of coating. What kind of coating does it have? Most of them are going to have a polytetrafluoroethylene coating, or PTFE, or commonly referred to as Teflon coating. It's also important to kind of recognize which wires are kind of hydrophilic as opposed to hydrophobic. A lot of these wires, you'll see that they'll have like hydrophilic tips, which just mean that you do have to lubricate those tips with water before using. Otherwise, they kind of get sticky really quickly. And then another configuration that's important to remember is kind of the tip configuration. So is it a straight wire? Is it an angled wire? Is it a J-shaped wire? So those are going to be really kind of chosen depending on where you're trying to get access into. I think a lot of us, for example, will use an angled wire in the pancreatic duct, or if we're trying to get into specific branches within the intrahepatic, those can be particularly helpful. And then the third kind of thing to look at is the length of the guide wire. So we had mentioned previously short and long systems. So short wires are typically 260 to 270 centimeters in length. And then long guide wires are 450 centimeters in length. And then also for those endoscopists who perform kind of balloon enteroscopy or alternate anatomy cases, they're going to be using guide wires that range from 550 to 600 centimeters in length. So I think that's kind of a practical way of thinking about guide wires as a whole.
I appreciate that. The other things I would add to that discussion are diameter and also stiffness. So Dr. Girotra touched on many uses other than pancreatic biliary uses for guide wires. And in those situations, oftentimes a very stiff guide wire may be preferable, particularly for luminal dilation or advancing a tube. And then diameter, essentially in endoscopy, the guide wires we use range from 0.018 inch to 0.035 inch. With the very small caliber guide wires mainly being used deep in the biliary tree or in the pancreatic duct, as Dr. Han alluded to. Dr. Girotra, we're going to go back to you. What would you say are the biggest areas of need for future iterations of guide wires?
So there happen to be many. As Dr. Han in the beginning of this interview alluded to, not much has happened in the past decade in terms of advancement of design, but a lot has happened in terms of how we use these guide wires, what are the indications, and a lot of expansion has happened due to explosion of indications of therapeutic endoscopic ultrasound. What is desired is randomized studies probably to look at different indications of use of these guide wires for comparison, head-to-head comparison between guide wires. Also, what is required is development of newer guide wires for specific indications. We do have actually some J-shaped guide wires which help in coiling within the ducts, for safe advancement across strictures, etc., which technically in ex vivo models has been shown to decrease chances of small ductal perforations, not really proven in human subjects though, but those studies are required. Also, what is required is design of guide wires which is safe for exchange, especially when used with endoscopic ultrasound needles. There is a small but finite chance of shearing the sheath, which can be prevented by a lot of endoscopist maneuvers, but we do not have specific guide wires which are built specifically for this indication. So I think those are some of the unmet areas where research is required and further development, R&D is required in terms of guide wire design and its subtype for different indications.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more actually with everything you said. We look at the world of interventional radiology and interventional cardiology, and the variations of guide wires they have makes GI guide wires look like children's toys. They have so many shapes, variations to get them into particular situations, and I think historically, unfortunately, GI has lagged behind cardiology for about 5 to 10 years with nearly everything, device-wise or accessory-wise. and in this case, even longer with guide wires. So that's an extraordinarily important thing that you mentioned. The other thing I would go on record as saying, I've done a lot of these podcasts, and I think this particular manuscript and this particular discussion is really of importance, not only to therapeutic endoscopists, but endoscopists in general, in the setting that as long as you have a guide wire in the place you want it to be, your procedure, no matter how bad the complication, no matter how bad the situation, really is not without options. Guide wires are, particularly for therapeutic endoscopy, ERCP, and therapeutic EUS, this makes or breaks the procedure. If you have a guide wire past a really tight stricture or across a perforation or whatever the situation may be, you're not out of options. You don't need to call an interventional radiologist or a surgeon or anybody else. You still have things that you can do. So the importance of a guide wire, to me, this is like foundational for anybody who wants to be a really good endoscopist. That's something that I teach our advanced fellows, and strongly believe that the guide wire can save you in a lot of difficult situations. With that all being said, what do you think? I'll start with Dr. Hahn. What do you think is the single most important addition to this version of the manuscript compared to the prior version?
Yeah, Ryan, I really do think that, and this was kind of requested by our audience, but providing kind of a detailed step-to-step guide in terms of the equipment that we need to use for performing EUS-related procedures such as a rendezvous and hepatogastrostomy. I do think we kind of really set the table for the bare minimum in terms of material required. A lot of endoscopists like conceptually understand how a rendezvous and hepatogastrostomy work, but when you actually do it, you really need to have that know-how, and you need to have those kind of materials available. The other kind of consideration, I think, is in terms of when to use guide or how to use guide wires when we're deploying stents transmurally as well. That's so important. And as you mentioned, Ryan, there's so many kind of salvage scenarios that are completely dependent on the use of a guide wire. So I think we really provide good context for that. And hopefully this will serve as kind of a foundation piece for a lot of endoscopists beginning their career.
Yeah, the guide wire really is the essence of, to me, of therapeutic EUS. There really is no, outside of draining a giant pseudocyst or fluid collection, there really is no therapeutic EUS in terms of ductal drainage. And I would even go as far as to say something like a gallbladder drainage or gastroenterostomy without a guide wire, because I'm a big believer that even after I start the procedure and kind of puncture into my target, after I deploy that kind of first flange of the lumen opposing stent, for example, first thing I do is put out a guide wire as a safety mechanism. It's preloaded in my catheter, and it goes out into the gallbladder, or goes out into the GI lumen, such that if things fall apart, I still may have options. And then, clearly, as you mentioned, for biliary drainage, that guide wire is going to help you get the stent nicely opposed between the liver and the stomach, or between the bile duct and the duodenum. So that's super important. Mohit, what would you say are some additional substantial improvements with this manuscript, or some additional take-home points that you would like to impress upon our listeners and viewers?
So, Ryan, I agree with what you have said. I mean, just wanted to add before I answer this question that, our interventional fraternity has come up with freehand techniques for performance of many of these therapeutic endoscopic ultrasound-based luminal access procedures and ductal access procedures. But many of us still prefer using guide wires, both as a safety mechanism as well as placement of coaxial stents within the lamps, let's say, for example. So those, we cannot undermine the importance of guide wires in all those techniques. That's number one. Number two is how this guide wire, this document we have is different. In addition to what Sam has already mentioned, is we have taken into consideration all the experience that our fraternity has gathered over the past, let's say, a decade or so of performing therapeutic endoscopic ultrasound and noticing what the shortcomings of these wires, what the shortcomings of the techniques, where exactly these guide wires could be of additional help. For example, in closure of defects, when we put over the scope clip and try to get back to the area of defect, the endoscopic visualization may be very poor. And specifically in those situations, placement of a guide wire may actually help get back to the same spot, improve endoscopic visualization. These are things which very rarely can be conceptualized at the beginning. Only when you encounter such situations, those clinical scenarios come up, we get those data, those reports and those series are published, and that those are the kind of data which we have included in this manuscript to bring to our readers attention. Those could be additional areas where guide wires can be used. So those are also substantial, in my mind, substantial improvements in this version of the manuscript compared to the previous one from 2007.
Thanks, Mohit. I agree completely. Those are all important things, and it just speaks to what kind of our overarching theme is just the value of a guide wire in general. And all of us being interventional endoscopists may be more acutely aware of that than those who are not interventional endoscopists, but it is an important take-home point, without a doubt. I think with that, we'll wrap it up for this session of the ASGE podcast. I would like to thank Dr. Girotra and Dr. Hahn for joining me today, and I certainly appreciate their insight on this topic as well as their hard work in drafting this particular document for ASGE. So thank you both again, and I appreciate to all our viewers and listeners out there. Thank you.
Thanks, ASGE. Thanks, Ryan, Lauren, and
Yeah.
Sam.